Firefighting taught me to spot danger before it spread. A shift in the wind, a flicker where there shouldn't be one. Marriage is no different. Small things, new habits, little changes, tell you everything, if you know how to listen. My name is Gavin Kinney, 62 years old. Retired firefighter, now running a small farm outside Billings, Montana. I spent 30 years running into burning buildings, spent another 20 raising 4 kids after my wife passed. Hard work's the only thing I ever trusted. That, and family. The farm was quiet that morning, just the way I liked it. Cold air, smell of damp earth, a few cows shifting in the pasture. I leaned against the fence, hands wrapped around my coffee mug, watching the sky turn orange over the fields. These hands had pulled men from burning wrecks, pumped life back into the barely breathing. Now they worked the land, held my grandkids, fixed whatever broke around here. That was enough for me. Grandpa. A small body slammed into my leg. I barely had time to set my coffee down before little Tommy latched onto my knee, grinning up at me. Kid had my blue eyes, but the rest was his father, stubborn, always moving. You running laps this early? I asked, ruffling his hair. Dad says I gotta eat my eggs first. His face scrunched up like I'd asked him to swallow a nail. Smart man, your dad. The screen door creaked, and my daughter, Emily, stepped onto the porch, coffee in one hand, baby in the other. You're a bad influence, she called. I held up my hands. I didn't say a word. She rolled her eyes but smiled. Emily was tough, like her mother. Married to a good man, raising a family the right way. If nothing else, I'd done that right, raised my kids to be strong. The kind of people you could trust. The morning went like it always did: chores, breakfast, phone calls about feed prices. Routine. Dependable. That was the way I ran my life. I didn't like surprises. Joanne called mid-morning. Hey, Hon, she said, voice light, like she'd just thought of me. How's the farm? Same as always, I said, wiping sweat from my brow. You. Oh, busy. This campaign is eating up all my time. Still in Seattle? She hesitated. It was quick, but I caught it. Yeah. Meetings ran late last night. Just grabbing a coffee before the next one. I leaned against the truck. That right? Ma'am, a car horn blared in the background. She let out a breath, exasperated. Traffic's a nightmare. I said nothing. Just listened. Gavin? Yeah. You okay? Fine. A beat of silence. All right. Well, I'll call you later, okay. I hung up without another word. That pause. That split second before she said, yeah. I'd been married long enough to know the difference between truth and hesitation. It wasn't much, but I'd seen enough house fires start with a single spark. An hour later, I drove into town for supplies. Billings wasn't big, but it was home. The feed store, the old diner, the hardware shop with the same creaky floorboards it had when I was a kid. Everyone knew everyone. That was the thing about small towns, you couldn't hide much. I grabbed a bag of feed from the back of my truck and nodded at Craig Harrington, my neighbor, who was fussing over a tray of tomato plants outside the garden center. Morning, Craig. Gavin, he said, straightening up. He was stocky, always in old jeans and a flannel. Got another cold front coming in. You might want to cover those seedlings. I'll manage. Craig wiped his hands on his pants. You hear about that new fella over at the Ridgeway offices? Fancy businessman, foreign. Owns a chain of hotels or something. Can't say I have. Craig shrugged. Saw your wife having lunch with him at the steakhouse couple days back. Figured it was work. I kept my face blank. My pulse didn't change. That's so? Yeah. He picked at a leaf. Didn't think much of it. Just thought I'd mention it. Appreciate it. I loaded the feed into the truck and drove home slow. Not because I needed time to think. I already knew. I just needed to decide what to do about it. I didn't mention it when I got home. Not to Emily, not to anyone. No sense in stirring up a mess before I knew exactly what I was dealing with. I went about my evening like always, fixed the busted latch on the chicken coop, made sure the generator had fuel in case that cold front hit harder than expected, sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon once the sun went down. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Joanne was supposed to call, but she didn't. I let it slide. Once. The next morning, I made a few calls. One to a buddy of mine who still worked at the firehouse, another to an old friend who ran private security. Just general questions. Who owns what? Who's been in town lately? Anything I ought to know. I didn't tell them why I was asking. Didn't need to. Joanne finally called around noon. Hey, babe, she said, voice bright. Sorry I didn't call last night. Meetings ran late, and I just crashed. That right? Yeah. I didn't even eat dinner. I was so exhausted. I let the silence stretch a little too long. I wanted to see if she'd fill it. Sure enough, Gavin, are you okay? You've been quiet lately. Busy, that's all. She exhaled, like she wanted to say something else but thought better of it. Well, I'll be home tomorrow night. Can't wait to see you. Likewise. I didn't say love you. Neither did she. After I hung up, I drove into town and parked outside the little diner on Main. Sonia, the cashier from the grocery store, was on break, leaning against the wall with a cigarette. She looked up when I walked over. Well, if it isn't Mr. Kinney, she said, blowing smoke to the side. What brings you to my corner of the world? Just grabbing coffee. Uh-huh. She squinted at me. You're a man of habit. And habit says you make your own damn coffee at home. I smirked. Maybe I just wanted to say hello. She snorted. Bull. What do you want to ask? I liked Sonia. She didn't waste time on nonsense. You saw Joanne in here the other night, I said, watching her reaction. She took another drag, then tapped her cigarette against the wall. Saw her, yeah? Wasn't alone. I nodded. Who was he? She tilted her head, sizing me up. Looked like money. Tall. Sharp suit. Kinda European looking. That tracked. He order for her? I asked. She looked amused. You know, I didn't think much of it at the time, but yeah, he did. Like he knew what she'd want. I clenched my jaw but kept my face neutral. Appreciate it. She took a final drag, then flicked the cigarette into the gutter. You gonna do something about it? Already am. I walked back to my truck, my mind already turning. Joanne had no idea I was onto her, and that was exactly how I wanted it. A fool rushes in, makes a scene, lets emotions get the best of him. But I'd spent my life in the kind of work where losing control got people killed. I wasn't about to start now. That night, I went through our joint bank account. Joanne had a separate account for work expenses, which I never bothered checking, but the household account? That was my domain. And sure enough, 3 separate charges from the Everett Grand, a luxury hotel in Seattle. One was just a bar tab. The other 2? Overnight stays. I sat back in my chair, rubbed my hand over my beard. That was all I needed. I wasn't the kind of man to go looking for trouble, but I sure as hell wasn't going to let it sit in my house, eating my food, sleeping in my bed, and thinking I wouldn't notice. I made one last call. The next day, I'd be seeing an old friend. I took the drive up to Missoula early, before the sun had fully broken over the horizon. The air was crisp, the road quiet. Nothing but the sound of the tires humming beneath me. I kept the radio off. I needed to think. The man I was meeting owed me a favor. His name was Dan, an old firehouse buddy who'd traded in smoke jumping for private security work years back. We'd pulled each other out of some rough situations before, the kind most men don't walk away from. That kind of thing doesn't get forgotten. I pulled into a diner off the highway, the kind of place that hadn't changed its menu in 40 years, and found Dan already waiting in a booth, sipping black coffee. His face was harder than I remembered, but we weren't young anymore. Jesus, Gavin, he said, shaking his head as I slid into the booth across from him. Still built like you could carry a grown man out of a burning house. I smirked. That's 'cause I still could. The waitress came over, topped off his cup, then looked at me. Coffee, black, I said. She nodded and walked off without a word. Dan leaned back, studying me. You didn't drive all the way up here to catch up. No, I said, cutting straight to it. I need information. He stirred his coffee with the handle of his spoon, not drinking it. That bad? Worse. He nodded, like he understood everything I wasn't saying. What's the name? I pulled a folded napkin from my pocket, smoothed it out on the table, and wrote the name in clean, steady letters. Miles D'Angelo. Dan exhaled through his nose. Sounds like money. He is. The waitress came back with my coffee, and we both waited until she was gone before I spoke again. He's screwing my wife. Dan whistled low, shaking his head. And you want dirt. I want leverage. Dan didn't ask any stupid questions. He pulled out his phone, tapped a few things, and then sat back. Give me a couple hours. You sticking around? I nodded. Got nowhere better to be. We ate in silence, and when we were done, I took a slow drive through town, killing time. The phone rang just after noon. Dan's voice was steady. You were right to look. Go on. Miles D'Angelo. Italian by birth, American by convenience. Built his business on real estate and international trade, but that's not where the real money is. He deals in high-risk investments, some of them legal, some not. Recently had to sell off a couple properties to cover a bad debt. Looks like he's scrambling to keep everything looking clean. How bad? Bad enough that if the right people knew, he'd be in deep shit. I nodded to myself. That was all I needed. Dan hesitated. Gavin, you sure you want to do this? Want to? I scoffed. No, but it needs doing. There was a pause, then he let out a breath. All right, then. I'll send you the files. I hung up, rested my hands on the steering wheel, and watched people move about their day like nothing had changed. By nightfall, I had everything I needed: bank records, property transfers, names of people he owed. I sat at my kitchen table, reading over it all, and for the first time in days, I felt calm. Joanne thought she was in control, thought she had the upper hand, thought she could sneak around behind my back without consequences. She had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I made my move. I wasn't the type to act on impulse, never had been. Firefighting teaches you to think 3 steps ahead, to anticipate how things will play out before you step into the heat. This wasn't any different. I'd spent enough time gathering my pieces, now it was time to place them. Joanne was due back that evening. I went about my day as usual, kept things looking normal. Fed the cattle, split some wood, spent a little time with the grandkids. Didn't let a damn thing on. Mid-afternoon, I made a call. D'Angelo, the voice on the other end, answered. Smooth. Confident. The kind of man who was used to being in charge. Miles, I said evenly. You don't know me. Name's Gavin Kinney. A pause. Then, slightly wary, all right. What can I do for you, Mr. Kinney? I smiled to myself. You've been seeing my wife. The silence stretched. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, voice tight. Sure you do, I said, voice calm, unshaken. She's blonde, charming, likes the validation. You met her on a business trip. Probably told you I was some old, simple farmhand. Easy to fool. That sound about right? Another pause. Listen, Mr. Kinney, let's skip the part where you insult both our intelligence and get to the point. I leaned back in my chair, glancing at the folder in front of me, full of every piece of dirt I had on him. See, I don't much care about you screwing my wife. What I do care about is the fact that you owe some very dangerous people a lot of money. And I just so happen to have my hands on the details. His breath hitched, just slightly. I don't know what you think you have. Oh, I know what I have. I let that hang for a second. Now, you've got 2 choices, Miles. 1, you pack up, leave my wife alone, and disappear before I make sure the wrong people get their hands on this information. 2, you ignore me, keep playing your game, and watch your entire damn world crumble. I could hear him breathing, trying to work through the math in his head. I'll pay you, he said finally. Whatever you want. I chuckled. I don't need your money. I need you gone. More silence. Then, finally, he exhaled, long and slow. Fine. Good. I stood up, grabbed my coat. And just so we're clear, if I ever see you near my wife again, I won't be making phone calls next time. I hung up before he could respond. Joanne got home that evening, pulling into the driveway like nothing had changed. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching her. She stepped out of the car, smiling. Hey, babe, she said, walking toward me. God, I'm exhausted. That trip was brutal. I nodded, looking her over. Traffic was awful, she went on, brushing a hand through her hair. Meetings dragged on, and I know about him, I said flatly. She froze mid-step, blinked. What? I held her gaze, waiting, letting it sink in. She forced out a laugh. Gavin, what the hell are you talking about? Miles, I said, voice calm. Your business trip? The late nights? I know it all. Her face went pale. She opened her mouth, shut it again, then tried, Gavin, you're misunderstanding. I shook my head. Save it. I stepped down from the porch, closing the distance between us. I already dealt with him. He won't be a problem anymore. Her eyes widened, fear creeping in. What did you do? I smirked. Not what you're thinking. But let's just say he's got bigger problems than you now. She swallowed hard, looking away. Gavin, don't, I said. Don't insult me with excuses. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. She'd made her choices. Now, she'd live with them. You want out? I asked. You want to chase some fantasy with men who tell you what you want to hear? Fine. But you don't get to play house here anymore. She shook her head, voice breaking. Gavin, please. I stepped back, nodding toward the door. Go pack a bag. And just like that, it was over. Joanne packed in silence. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching as she moved around the bedroom, shoving clothes into a suitcase with shaky hands. She wasn't crying anymore. Maybe she knew it wouldn't do her any good. Maybe she was just too damn shocked that I wasn't giving her some big emotional scene, wasn't yelling, wasn't begging her for answers I already had. "You're being cruel," she muttered after a while, not looking at me. I let out a short laugh. "Cruel?" I shook my head. "No, Joanne. Cruel would be dragging this out, letting you keep playing your little game while I pretended not to notice." She zipped the suitcase hard enough to make the teeth catch, then sighed in frustration and yanked it free. "Where am I supposed to go?" "Not my problem." She turned then, eyes flashing with something close to anger. "You think this is all black and white, don't you? That I'm just some villain in your perfect little story." "Perfect." I let out another low laugh. "Yeah, sweetheart. Nothing says perfect marriage like sneaking around with another man behind your husband's back." Her jaw clenched. "You were never home." I tilted my head, unimpressed. "You knew who I was when you married me." She didn't have an answer for that. I let her finish packing, then walked her out to the driveway. The night was cold, the wind cutting through the silence like a blade. She stood there for a moment, gripping the handle of her suitcase, her whole body tense. "This doesn't have to be the end," she said quietly. "People come back from worse." I studied her. The woman I'd once thought I'd grow old with. The woman I'd built a life around. "Not us," I said. Her face crumpled for half a second before she forced it blank again. She nodded once, then climbed into her car. The headlights flashed on, cutting harsh beams through the night. She didn't look back as she pulled away. I watched the taillights disappear down the road, then turned and walked back inside. The house felt different. Not empty, not broken, just quiet. Like something heavy had finally been lifted. The next morning, I drove into town. Stopped by the diner for coffee, let Sonia pour it without saying a word about the look on my face. Swung by the feed store, picked up an order I didn't really need. Life had a way of moving forward whether you were ready for it or not, and I wasn't about to sit around wallowing. I ran into Craig outside the hardware store, where he was loading bags of soil into the back of his truck. He took one look at me and nodded. "She gone?" I took a sip of coffee. "Yeah," he grunted. "Good." That was all he said, and it was all I needed. By noon, the whole damn town probably knew. Small places like this, news traveled fast, and I had no doubt people were already whispering. Some would pity me. Some would wait for me to crack, to see if I'd get angry, start drinking, fall apart. They'd be disappointed. I went about my work, kept my head down. The farm didn't stop needing me just because my marriage had collapsed. My grandkids still needed someone to teach them how to fix a broken fence, still needed someone to remind them that when life kicked you down, you got back up. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Craig showed up at my porch with a six-pack. "Figured you could use a beer," he said, handing me one. I cracked it open, took a long pull. Figured right. He lowered himself onto the porch steps with a groan. "So, what's next?" I thought about it for a second, watching the wind shift through the trees. "Same as always," I said finally. "Keep working. Keep moving." Craig nodded. That's the way. And it was. Because men like us? We didn't break. We didn't wallow. We built. We endured. And we damn sure didn't let anyone take us for fools twice. A week passed, then another. Life didn't stop because a marriage ended. The farm still needed tending, the animals still needed feeding, and my grandkids still ran through the house like little tornadoes, unaware that anything had changed. And that was the way I wanted it. Joanne reached out once, a text that simply read, "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a minute, then deleted it. There was nothing left to say. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. The town did what small towns do, talked. At the feed store, the diner, the gas station, people watched me a little too long, their voices dipping low when I walked by. Some meant well, offering a handshake or a clap on the back, a quiet, heard about what happened. "Sorry, man." Others were just looking for a story, hoping for some drama, a fight, a scene. They wouldn't get one. Craig stopped by more often, never saying much, just showing up when it counted. That's how men like us handled things, through actions, not words. One afternoon, I was hauling lumber from the truck when my phone buzzed. Not Joanne this time. It was an old number I hadn't seen in years. "Gavin Kinney," I answered. A pause. Then, I heard what happened. The voice was low, rough, like whiskey over gravel. I smirked. "And here I thought you only kept tabs on the rich and powerful." "I keep tabs on people who interest me," he said, and I could hear the amusement. "And you always did know how to handle your problems." I tossed the last plank onto the pile. "Is this a social call? Or you got something for me?" He chuckled. "I might. You ever think about coming back to work? I wiped my hands on my jeans, glanced out over the land I'd built, the home I'd kept standing. I already got a job. Yeah, he said, but do you ever miss the fire? The kind of work we used to do wasn't about running into burning buildings. It was about strategy, about reading people, about knowing exactly where to apply pressure to get what you wanted. I had a feeling he wasn't talking about firefighting. I think I've had enough flames for a while, I said, leaning against the truck. Fair enough. He let the silence stretch for a beat. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. I ended the call, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and took a long breath of the cold Montana air. The past had a way of knocking on your door just when you thought you'd closed it for good. But I wasn't a man who looked back. Inside, Emily was cooking, the smell of steak and onions drifting through the house. The grandkids were piled on the floor in the living room, coloring, laughing, their world unshaken. I leaned in the doorway, watching them for a second, letting it all settle. I wasn't broken. I wasn't lost. I was right where I was supposed to be. A month passed, then two. The first frost hit early that year, creeping over the fields in the dead of night, leaving the grass brittle under my boots in the morning. Winter was settling in, but the farm was ready. I'd spent the last few weeks stacking firewood, repairing the barn roof, making sure the animals had what they needed. The kind of work that kept a man steady. The kind that reminded you what really mattered. Joanne had moved to a rental across town. Word was she wasn't doing too well. Whatever fantasy she'd been chasing had dried up fast. Miles had vanished, just like I told him to. And with him went the attention, the gifts, the validation she'd been so hungry for. Without a man feeding her lies, she was left with nothing but herself. She tried reaching out again. Called twice, left a voicemail the second time. I didn't listen to it. Just deleted it and kept moving. Divorce papers went through clean. She didn't fight. Maybe she knew better. Maybe she was just too tired. Either way, I got the house, the land, and everything that mattered. She got her name on a lease and a couple of suitcases. Seemed fair. Craig and I sat on the porch one evening, watching the last of the daylight bleed out over the hills. He took a slow sip of his beer, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then nodded toward the pasture. You ever think about selling? I glanced at him, then back out at the land. No. He nodded, like that was the answer he expected. Figured. Silence stretched between us, comfortable, easy. He tipped his bottle back, then smirked. Word is, Joanne's having a rough go of it. I shrugged. Not my concern. Yeah. Still, town's been talking. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. She had a lot to say when she was playing happy wife. Guess folks don't listen so much when you lose the house. I didn't smile, but I didn't feel bad either. She'd built her life on what other people thought of her. Now, there wasn't much left. The screen door creaked, and Emily stepped out, brushing her hands on a dish towel. Dad, can you help with the generator later? It's making that noise again. I nodded. Yeah, I'll take a look. She hesitated, then sat down next to me, glancing between Craig and me. She came by today. I didn't ask who. I already knew. Didn't say much, she continued. Just wanted to see the kids. Craig exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Hell of a time to start caring. Emily frowned. I don't think she knows what she wants. I finished my beer, set the empty bottle down by my boot. Not my problem. Emily studied me for a second, like she wanted to say something else, then just sighed. Guess not. She stood, stretched. Dinner's almost ready. When she went inside, Craig gave me a look. You ever gonna say anything to her? What's there to say? He grunted, shifting in his seat. Nothing, I guess. The sun dipped lower, the cold settling in deep. The world kept turning. By Christmas, Joanne had stopped trying. Maybe she finally understood what she'd lost. Maybe she was just tired of being ignored. Either way, she faded into the background like a story people had already heard too many times. The grandkids tore through the house Christmas morning, laughter echoing off the walls, wrapping paper scattered across the floor. Emily made coffee while her husband worked the stove, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt full. I sat back in my chair, watching them, listening to the crackle of the fire. I'd built this. With my hands, my time, my damn backbone. And no one was ever taking it from me again.